Mr. President, House Bill 1476 is that oil tax bill that we've all been waiting for. The bill that was introduced in the House as it came to us, of course, was triggered on a trigger. The bill was triggered on the big trigger triggering in on June 1. If that happened, the bill would become law. If it didn't, the bill would never become law. And what the bill would have done, and the big trigger kicked in, is it would have eliminated the triggers, the big and the small triggers, all the triggered exemptions, and it would have set the tax rate at 9.5%. Your Senate and Finance and Tax Committee had some differences with this as it came in. Number one, we were not too fond of the idea of triggering this on the trigger. So we set a date certain for the bill, and that date certain is January 1, 2016. At that time, we set the tax at 10%. Mr. President, that's what these amendments do. They set the tax at 10%, 5% production, and 5% extraction tax. If the big trigger was to kick in on June 1, they would enjoy that benefits of the big trigger for 6 months. The bill of amendments before you also set an effective date of December 1st for the end of the big trigger. The big trigger would then go away. Mr. President, we also put a reverse trigger on this bill. We eliminate the two triggers and then we bring one back. The reverse trigger states that if the price of oil goes above $90, stays there for 3 months, the production tax would go from 5% to 6%. So the total tax then would go from 10% to 11%. And it would stay there until the price of oil went below $90 for another 3 months. And that trigger has a inflator on it. And then the other thing that we did, we have in law today an exemption from the exemption tax for tertiary and secondary oil recovery. No extraction tax whatsoever on the incremental increase in the oil production. We had committee members that did not like that exemption. We figured it was put on at a time when we really didn't know what maybe the future could mean for CO2 enhanced oil recovery. So we're eliminating that exemption in the Bakken and Three Forks fields. You still have it in the outside areas of the Bakken. We have some investments already being made by people looking to take advantage of that. We do not want to renege on them. The other thing that the bill does, and this is a major thing, a major cost to the oil industry, as it came in, if the exemptions ended, we would have had wells that were already in the middle of a time period to receive an exemption. They may have been in the middle of their 75,000 barrels for the small trigger exemption. As the bill came to us, they would have been able to realize the benefit of that exemption throughout the life of the exemption that they had earned. We eliminated that effective December 1st, 2015. So, and that is a huge cost to the oil industry. But Mr. President, those are basically the amendments that you have before you on the 6th order here today. It came out of committee, I think 7-0 to pass on the amendments. I would hope we could pass them out here and then debate the bill.
Senator Sinner.
Mr. President, a question for the carrier. Just for the clarification of all the people that are here, the carrier stated that the trigger was on the production tax, and I believe I want to make sure that that's corrected and it's on the extraction tax.
Senator Cook, do you wish to answer the question?
I just did that to make sure he was listening. He's correct. It's the extraction tax.
Further discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the proposed amendments to House Bill 1476. As many senators as are in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. The amendments are adopted. To the 14th order, House Bill 1476 now is amended. Madam Secretary.
House Bill 1476, a bill for an act to amend and reenact subsection 4 of section 38 and sections 57 relating to oil extraction tax rates and exemptions, to provide for an exception, to provide for a legislative management study, to provide an effective date, and to provide an expiration date. The fiscal note indicates for the 15-17 biennium other fund revenues of $35 million.
Senator Cook.
Well, Mr. President, I think those amendments that we just passed pretty much explain the bill. We have a study in the bill at the end of the page also. I guess I overlooked that. Again, the effective date of the bill, January 1, 2016, the total tax on oil in North Dakota will go from 11.5% to 10%. December 1st, 2015, all triggers are gone. All the triggers are gone. The exemptions will end. Both triggered reductions and triggered exemptions will end. Mr. President, this has always been a controversial bill. This is the third session in a row that we've had it before us. It's a bill that we can have great debate. I would tell you that changing this bill brings certainty. Today, our extraction tax, our effective tax rate, today is 11.15%. That is the highest it's ever been in history. If the big trigger kicks in on June 1, that effective tax rate is going to go to 6.1%. That uncertainty creates uncertainty for our revenue picture. We've already seen what it's done to the revenue. We started out in December looking for $8.8 billion oil tax revenue. The last revenue forecast said 3.4. If this trigger kicks in for a year, or for the whole biennium, we go down to $2.2 billion. It creates uncertainty for the oil industry. They have no idea what the tax rate is going to be on June 1. I would argue that the triggers don't work. We've already seen 100 rigs laid down. By the time the trigger kicks in effect to give them a benefit, it's too late. Mr. President, it creates uncertainty for our friends on the MHA Nation. They have made it clear that if these triggers kick in, they're going out of the agreement. It affects them also. Last night, as we finished one of what I thought was final meetings on this bill, the chairman of the MHA Nation stood before us. I asked the question, would you rather see us kill this bill, or would you rather see us pass this bill? He would like it better, but he said he'd rather see it pass. Mr. President, this is a great bill for partisan politics. We've had it for this is the third session. For those of us who get competitive, for those of us who like to flex the partisan muscle, it's a great bill to step into the boxing ring and put the gloves on. We can take it on the campaign trail. It generates letters to the editor. It's just one of those great issues that those of us in this political arena, if we want to be partisan, to have a real good boxing match off of. But Mr. President, I've also found out that if you don't want to fight, if maybe finding a good solution is what it is we should do, and if you reach across and you find somebody else that's just looking at finding the right solution, it's not that difficult. Mr. President, it's not that difficult. The bill before you today has the fingerprints, they're bipartisan fingerprints all over it. Mr. President, I would say the people of North Dakota send us here to solve problems. We may think our boxing matches are entertaining, but they send us here to solve problems. Today you have before you a solution. I think it's a good solution. Came out of committee with a 6-1 do pass vote. And Mr. President, I would hope this body can concur.
Senator Schneider.
Mr. President, I thank the carrier for his description of the bill, and I intend to set partisanship absolutely on the shelf. And in my remarks here today, focus in on procedure and policy. And I think to illustrate the procedure of this bill, I'm going to reference but not criticize, which would be impermissible under our rules, but just reference another bill. So let's take the Senate back to last Thursday. We considered whether to pass a bill containing $3 million for early childhood education grants. That was 1 week ago, but the bill was introduced on January 8th. It had a hearing in the Senate on January 13th. It was referred to the Appropriations Committee. It had a hearing there on February 11th. We debated it on the floor on February 25th, crossed over to the House on March 3rd. It had a committee hearing over there on St. Patrick's Day. It was considered in House Appropriations on March 25th, passed the House on April 15th of this year, and finally got back to us last Thursday. That was the serious scrutiny that a bill that ended up funding pre-kindergarten education at $3 million received. 3 months of consideration. Consideration by 4 committees in this legislature. Last Thursday, Mr. President, this bill didn't exist. I literally have leftovers in my fridge that are older than this bill. And that's not very funny. This bill doesn't appropriate $3 million. It affects directly how we tax a critical industry and driver of our economy in this state. It affects the livelihood and well-being of thousands of North Dakotans in a sovereign nation that exists within our borders. It affects a tax that was put in place by a vote of the people themselves. And it deeply affects future generations of North Dakotans, those who will live in this state after the last drop of oil has been profitably extracted from the ground. To make a decision of this magnitude over the course of 5 working days is legislative malpractice. The heart of this bill is a 23% permanent reduction to the oil extraction tax, and never once during this abbreviated, ramrodded process did the majority take testimony from the tax department or the Department of Mineral Resources on the long-term, I stress long-term, fiscal effect of the 23% cut to the oil extraction tax. Mr. President, how could we possibly shove through this bill without considering the long-term effect of the 23% cut to the oil extraction tax? I would never use my time here in this body to chastise another member, especially not the majority leader. He's my friend. But friends can tell friends when they're doing something wrong, and I will key in on the process. The cram down of this bill through the process is wrong. This process, the process this bill followed, to be candid, Mr. President, is more cavalier and more arrogant than anything I have seen in my 4 sessions.
I'm going to ask you, you've made your point. You're talking well outside the bill. I'm going to ask you to constrain the remainder of your remarks to the bill. You've made the point that you do not like the process, but to use the verbiage that you're using and continuing on in this vein is out of order.
The process of this bill is inimical to the substance of this bill, Mr. President.
You've called it into question. To continue on this line is out of order.
I will not continue along this line, Mr. President. But when this happens, Mr. President, mistakes are made regarding the substance of the bill. Like yesterday, when the Finance and Tax Committee forgot to vote on it. Whoops. Some of the members of the majority had a good laugh about this bill when that happened. But let's look at the substance, Mr. President. Let's do something the committees didn't do on this. Let's take a look at, with the best evidence possible, the long-term loss of revenue from this 23% cut to the extraction tax. Using projections from the Department of Mineral Resources, the Energy Information Administration, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group regarding the price and production of oil, the 23% cut to the extraction tax stands to cost the people of our state over $4 billion in the next decade, unconsidered by the committees in this process, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President. But these are just projections, I've heard. Projections can be wrong. Fair enough, that's absolutely true. To that I say, where are your numbers? Where are your numbers on the long-term cost of this bill? How much do you reasonably believe a 23% cut to the extraction tax is going to cost our people over the life of this world-class oil play that we have in our state? There are no projections from the majority. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the long-term cost of this bill has been hidden from the public as an affirmative matter. I think important to the substance of this bill, Mr. President, are projections that were made about a similar cut to the extraction tax made last session. This goes to the heart of what projections can mean. Back in 2013, the Legislative Council estimated that a 30% cut to the extraction tax Could cost the state $595 million in the first 5 years. Tax department said it was more like $1 billion. I now want to apologize for how far off those numbers were, because we cited to them. And so I feel I owe it to the body, as considering this bill, to talk about how far off those projections were. The actual lost revenue from 30%, lost revenue from the extraction tax proposed last session, Mr. President, actually would have been over $876 million and counting. So yes, the projections aren't always accurate. Sometimes they're woefully conservative. This bill might cost an arm, might cost an arm and a leg, might cost an arm and 2 legs. We don't know. Projections vary. But the bottom line is we are talking about a multi-billion-dollar proposition. So that's the extraction tax side of the equation, Mr. President. I don't think this bill can be accurately considered unless we look at the other side of the oil tax equation, which is the production tax. The carrier of the bill mentioned the overall tax rate. If you add the production tax and the extraction tax together, you have an overall tax rate. I think it's fair to take a look at the production tax side of the equation. Promise was made last fall that Western North Dakota should receive 60% of the production tax. Here today, we're debating cutting the extraction tax, the other side of the equation, by 23%. The argument was made that the state needs a greater share of the production tax from oil-impacted communities than the promises that were made. But now, with the other hand, we're giving away 23% on the extraction tax side. Mr. President, I don't represent Western North Dakota. I don't represent a community that has felt heavy impacts from oil development. And so I can't tell locally elected leaders out there who are daily dealing with housing, crowded schools, challenges to quality of life, I can't tell them how to feel. But I know how I would feel. Feel extremely disappointed with what is going on with the extraction tax side of the equation. So this bill relates directly to a broken word on the production tax. There's another promise that was made last fall as well. I won't speak of the other body. I will say it was a majority leader in this Capitol, but it wasn't the majority leader in this body, made a promise. We have absolutely no intention of looking at the oil extraction tax in the largest newspaper in North Dakota. That's what was said during the heated campaign season. Here we are, Mr. President, day 74, we're looking at the extraction tax. And so let's do just that. Let's look at the professed reasons about why this bill was advanced on day 70 of an 80-day legislative session. First, that this fixes the trigger. Hardly the case. Can't be fairly seen as entirely fixing the trigger. In the near term, the bill leaves in place the trigger during the months when it's most likely to go into effect. And then when it's most likely going to be out of effect, puts in place a permanent 23% cut to the oil extraction tax. In the long term, it creates a reverse trigger. Now, that's something new. And so in the near term, we're going to be holding our breath, hoping that the trigger doesn't go off. And in the long term, we're going to be talking with our constituents and perfect strangers about a reverse trigger for years to come if this bill passes, Mr. President. Second, that this bill is a hedge or some kind of insurance policy against low oil prices. If it is insurance, Mr. President, it is the worst and least affordable insurance product of all time. Not one of us, and no reasonable person in North Dakota would trade 23% of their revenue for the rest of their working lives in exchange for a guarantee that you're not going to experience a temporary result of complete loss of income. 5 months under the most recent futures numbers for oil. 11 months under the last legislative forecast in March. I would not want to be the agent tasked with selling this bill as an insurance policy. Third is that this will result in revenue stability. That's wrong. It's false. It's incorrect. Even with a flat tax, which this isn't because of the new reverse trigger, revenue will rise and fall with the price of this volatile commodity that we're taxing. Take a look at the price of WTI, just as an example. In March of last year, about $105 was the highest that it closed at that month. This March, $50. 5% of either of those numbers is a big difference in revenue collection. This will not result in stability in terms of our revenues. It will not stop volatility. That is a fool's errand when you're taxing a volatile commodity like this one. Fourth is that the so-called predictability of this bill will encourage production during downturns like the one we're experiencing right now. Mr. President, how could that conceivably be? How could that be the case that taking away a tax incentive that's intended to encourage production when times are tough and trading in its place a significant tax cut when times are good, how does that encourage predictability during a downturn in a market? If anything, the other current law does that much better than this bill does. So I'm not sure that professed rationale is a good reason to pass this bill either. As we did during the rush committee process, Mr. President, we have and will offer solutions to the trigger issue. That's really the heart of the matter here. We'll be discussing that later on a different order. To be clear, that industry, the oil industry, has positively transformed North Dakota. It has made our state the leading economy in the country. It has made our state the #2 oil producer in the nation. All of that has happened under a 6.5% extraction tax. We are extraordinarily thankful that the industry is thriving in North Dakota. We are proud of what the industry has done, amazed by its innovations in turning this previously unrecoverable resource into something profitable. We welcome this industry, and we're happy that it's done as well as it has under the 6.5% extraction tax. So I want to speak to really the motivation behind this bill. Not the motivation, but maybe the real reason why it was introduced. If you listen in the Capitol corridors and the hallways here in this building, Mr. President, you hear things like, we're still going to have a lot of money. Or, how much do you really need? Or what, if we just keep the tax in place, we're just going to spend more. I believe that is respectfully short-sighted. I believe it's ideological. Mr. President, we are the trustees of this one-time harvest of natural resource revenue. It must be made to benefit future generations of North Dakotans. This bill does the opposite. What is the impact on our legacy fund? No testimony was received or heard on that point. What is the impact on water projects on an ongoing basis? No testimony, not a clue. Can we continue to fund property tax relief at the level that we have in previous biennia if we cut the oil extraction tax by 23%? Mr. President, this bill leaves that question for somebody else down the road. On the other hand, with the benefit of perfect hindsight, we will know exactly what this bill costs the state of North Dakota. Imagine, Mr. President, a scenario under which the circumstances where the trigger would have gone into effect don't materialize. Turns out the trigger never would have gone off. The 23% cut to the extraction tax, that happens no matter what. Imagine a scenario where North Dakotans are filling up with $4 a gallon gas, and the numbers start rolling in on this bill. How much does this bill cost? $500 million, $200 million, maybe get lucky, maybe it's 150. But I imagine if those circumstances materialize, this bill will be the talk of the town. So in closing, Mr. President, I appreciate the body being gracious with our time. I asked my colleagues, before voting on this transformational bill, I believe it was billed as a monumental bill by the majority. I think that's true. Before voting on this monumental bill, ask yourself, what have we left behind before passing out this cut to the extraction tax? Have we endowed college scholarships like they have in Wyoming? Have we established a permanent university fund like they have in Texas? Mr. President, let's keep our eyes on the future. Let's reject this bill.
Senator Unruh.
Mr. President, let's take a step back into history, if we may, for just a moment. Back to the 1980s, when North Dakota learned the very difficult lesson of what an oil boom and bust is really about. Measure 6 passed on the ballot in 1980 as we approached the height of the boom creating a 6.5% extraction tax of the gross value of oil at the well. Well, Mr. President, when I say we, that was actually before I was born, not including me. But that's how long we've been dealing with this issue. A few years later, as rigs left our state and the price of oil plummeted, the big trigger, still in code today, was implemented by a Democrat-controlled Senate and a governor's office, moving the overall effective tax rate to a range from 5 to 9%. Just like I'm not the same person that I was when this policy went into effect, neither is oil production. The process, and most importantly, North Dakota is not the same as it was 30 years ago. So today we have before us a new policy. It's been contemplated over many legislative sessions. Not only did it take extreme compromise from all the parties involved to get to this point, Mr. President, but also the true realization that change is on the horizon. The exploration phase of the Bakken is quickly turning into the development stage, bringing our focus to long-term strategies and policies to help us meet the new challenges in front of us so that we can do the best we can for the next generation. An unpredictable tax revenue stream for our state is one of those challenges. When it comes to the oil tax, Mr. President, our revenue stream is based on 3 things: oil production, oil price, and the tax rate. Those of us here in this chamber can only control one of those things: the tax rate. As for the other numbers, production, price, they can be assumed and they can be manipulated to meet many different arguments. But the fact of the matter is that no one is certain what the price or production levels are going to be. They are so uncertain that our tax department is unable to forecast along beyond the next biennium and bienniums after that. So after months of endless discussion on how the triggers and effective tax rates would affect our revenue stream in the upcoming biennium, we decided to take action to create a more predictable and stable tax policy. That's not a fallacy. We believe that that is a good thing, and that is something that is good for North Dakota. We could complain about the process, Mr. President, or we could focus our efforts on the issue in front of us and do the best we can to implement the best oil tax policy for the people of North Dakota. After all, Mr. President, that's what we're here to do, the people's work. And that's what we've done with this bill. We've created a stable tax environment by reducing the fluctuation of the effective rate. We've created a policy that's competitive with other states to encourage long-term capital investments needed in North Dakota for both the state and the industry as we move forward in the new development stage of the Bakken. As I mentioned before, Mr. President, it took compromise. Fundamentally changing our tax structure takes participation in the conversation and compromise from all parties involved. We worked very hard to make sure that all parties were at the table during this discussion. The bill doesn't make everybody happy. In fact, I'm not sure you'll find a group that likes every section of the bill. But that's the beauty of it, Mr. President. That's why I encourage this body to keep this bill whole today. I'm sure we'll see attempts to change it and to compromise or to amend the compromise in front of us. I would urge this body to resist them. Any change moves the goalpost we've worked so hard to set. We've got a new policy with bipartisan input that will ensure the state, the 3 affiliated tribes, and the industry have a clear path forward to develop North Dakota's oil and gas reserves that we have been so very blessed with. This stable and predictable tax structure will provide North Dakota with what it needs today and with what it needs in future generations. Let's support that effort.
Senator Murphy.
Well, Mr. President, I've been taught by our culture, and I presume that most of the people in this body have been taught, that if an employee, no matter how well or how poorly paid, decides to make a drastic choice, that they should provide 2 weeks' notice. I happen to believe that the people of North Dakota deserve at least that. To offer less seems to me to be an insult to our constituents. Taking our process and setting it aside as if there's something to hide does not engender confidence or respect for us or our process. We all want respect for our process here. I know we all do. Here it is on the floor on the 74th day of a session that our leaders have publicly avowed was going to last about 75. Well, Mr. President, the oil industry, in my view, gave tacit approval of the tax rate when they came into this state and proceeded with their operations that have done so much good for our state. Our tax policy seemed not to hinder them whatsoever. That the activity has subsided is primarily due to price, not tax policy. We need to recognize that North Dakota is not the easiest place to proceed with oil mining. We have high winds that shut down our rigs. We have extreme cold that makes production difficult. We have a problem with transporting our oil out of our state. We have a problem with the workforce. There are a lot of problems that the industry needs to deal with and that we need to help them with. Tax policy has not hindered them. And when the price comes back, the activity will be here. Furthermore, and as a member of the Interim Energy Development Transmission Committee and on Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I've taken the opportunity to speak with not one or two, but 3 different oil industry CEOs over those years on an individual basis. And I have asked them when I've had that opportunity, what do you think about our tax? Because I want to do the right thing. And as previously mentioned in this debate already, we have talked about this for a few sessions. All 3 of those top officials at one time or another told me there is nothing wrong with your tax policy. In fact, one went on to say, you know, I've worked in the oil industry for 40 years around the world and in many states. And I have found that if the tax is too low, that we are not as good a corporate citizen. We're not as good a partner. And I left that night and I was thinking, how in the heck does that work? But then I kind of realized the psychology behind it. And it goes like this. Maybe some of you can relate to this, Mr. President. I gave my son a vehicle once, a pickup. And he changed the oil, but he didn't keep it very clean. It kind of bugged me. You know, dads want to see their children treat things with respect. Guess what happened when he bought his first vehicle? He took care of it. He had ownership. That's the psychology that's at play here with a decent tax rate. Mr. President, the people that I specifically represent need help from the state with water, bridges, road projects, and so do the other districts represented by your senators. It is my position that we can ill afford to lose these millions and millions of dollars that would be incurred by the passage of this bill. And so just a quick review of just a few water projects, and I'll be done, Mr. President. There are 4 major water supply projects which need funding. One is the Northwest Area Water Supply Project. They need $100 to $200 million to deliver treated water. The Southwest Pipeline Project, they got about $100 million that they need to finish infrastructure and some remaining costs after that. And we have WAS, the Western Area Water Supply. They need 100 to 150 million to complete their infrastructure. The Southwest in NAWS with WAS, along with the Red River Valley Supply Project, Red River, they need, 800 million? There are multiple rural water systems. Mr. President, this week, my rural water director from Grand Forks and Trail counties said we need $50 million because we got started early in the rural water process, and we have plastic pipes that are glued together because that was the best technology at the time in the early 70s. But by about 1977, they realized we needed to have gaskets. And now all of our plastic pipes are breaking at those joints, and when we do and we dig them up, we do replace them, but we've got many, many miles, about $50 million to try and stop the extreme water loss and to try and stay, if you'll pardon the pun, above water on the project. And we've got 3 major flood projects. There are people here that represent Fargo. They need flood control. So does Minot. That's a lot of money. 100 million and 800 million. Devil's Lake outlets, those outlets are completed, but they take about $11 million a year to maintain. Also multiple flood and local water management projects like Valley City, Grafton, Williston, and individual water resource districts. Mr. President, I appeal to the body to try and keep our revenue running. I hope that our oil industry will be here for many, many decades. Thank you.
Senator Marsolais.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I am a proud Native American enrolled at the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Tribe and a former chairman from 2008 to 2010. As tribal chairman, I always felt that position was equivalent to the President of the United States or the governor of our state. Our programs are identical to those governments, but on a smaller scale. The good senator from District 33 wanted to go back. Well, I'd like to go back at this time also. I'd like to go back to 1863, when we had treaties with our Native American nations. Believe it or not, at one time, my nation owned the Red River Valley. You know how much the government paid for that? 1 cent an acre. I was involved in the judicial system. In 2009, when I was tribal chairman, I went out to Washington, D.C. I told the judicial judge, I can solve this problem for you. We'll offer you $1 an acre for the Red River Valley. He said, I don't think that'll work. Wouldn't take the offer. But I did talk to my friend from the MHA Nation, tribal chairman. Maybe I talked to him on a native-to-native talk. But this is what he told me, that the MH Nation sits in the heart of the Bakken Three Forks, oil, and accounts for 30% of the total oil production in North Dakota. The MHA Nation sovereign right to tax economic activity within their boundaries because the threat of dual taxation from state and tribal. The MHA Nation entered into a tax sharing agreement with the state of North Dakota. And believe it or not, we do have another agreement in place, but it hasn't come to play yet. And it involves my nation, the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. You may ask me, why am I standing up speaking on this? We have over 35,000 members in our tribe, and we own land in western North Dakota. We have 800 members or more in the Trenton area, called the Trenton Indian Service Area. They have land over there. I have cousins that live in Trenton. That's why I'm standing up before this bill. Currently have a need to address dual taxation in other areas as well. As stated, For example, they currently do not collect a dime to the taxes on pipelines that cross and impact the reservation, even though they bear the expenses of cleaning up these spills. Now, is this right? That the MHA nation's got to pay for that, but they can't collect? Is it? I ask you as my colleagues, think about that. And another thing, at this time, I'd like to invite you up to visit me. I never see any legislators up there in my district. When I went out to Washington in April last year, representing the state of North Dakota for a Rural Veterans in America conference, they had a U.S. map up there. They had one poverty area in the state of North Dakota, and guess where it was? It was in my district. We have 65% unemployment in my district. And then you're going to pass on all these taxes to the big oil industries? The recent oil boom has been both a blessing and a curse on the MHA nation. With the crime that's going on, the roads that needs to be fixed, sewer and water, housing. I have the same thing in my nation. We have over 800 people homeless. I shouldn't say homeless because we don't let our natives live out in the sticks. We take them in under our roof. It's crowded homes. We might have 4 families living in one home. Can you imagine that? If you had your relatives come live with you? Mr. President, this ain't right. On behalf of the Native American nations in North Dakota, I ask that you defeat this bill. Thank you.
Senator Armstrong.
Mr. President, I've almost made it 2 sessions without talking about an oil and gas issue on the floor of this body that I wasn't part of carrying. But it's an issue I know a little bit about, and when I look for education issues, I look to my left. When I look to farming issues, I look behind me. And I also promised myself I wasn't going to talk about any numbers, but I'm gonna. One, water projects are funded from the extraction tax. So if the trigger is on, those water projects don't get any money. And 2, I find it a little interesting that people who spend the tax money call it a 23% tax cut, and people who pay the tax at 10% call it a 13% tax reduction. And if it's above $90 a barrel, it's a 5% tax reduction. And on December 2nd, if the trigger is still on, it's a 130% tax increase on the industry. And I know this because in April of 2009, I was sitting in a president's office of a small town oil company about 100 miles west of here. And I wasn't working for my dad yet at the time, but I was still fully engaged in the practice of criminal law. But the reason I remember this day so well is because we were all waiting for the markets to close at 2:30 Mountain Time. And we were all watching the price of oil. You see, Mr. President, in April of 2009, we were 1 day away from the big trigger going into effect. Now, because Good Friday was a bank holiday, there was confusion as to how the April price was being calculated. Calls were being made and people were trying to figure out what price was needed for the trigger to hit. So the entire industry, the people who make their money off of oil, were watching in eager anticipation. And they were rooting for the price to go down. And it wasn't just executives. It was rig workers hoping to keep their jobs. It was community officials hoping that the trigger would keep companies from leaving their communities. And it was small business owners who were experiencing growth after decades of decline. The trigger did not go into effect in May of 2009, in no small part actually because of a banking holiday. But let's talk about how ridiculous that scenario is for a second. Billions in dollars of revenue to the state of North Dakota hinged on 1 day's oil price and how a holiday was going to affect that monthly average. Why would we perpetuate such a volatile policy? Why would we perpetuate a policy that encourages the people who make their living off of oil to beg for lower prices? Now fast forward to this session. The whole session has been dominated by the trigger talk. Saving days has become the theme because if the trigger does or doesn't hit, we may have to come back in for a special session. Armchair future traders have given all kinds of reasons as to why the trigger will or will not hit. And we budget on the trigger being in effect for 11 months. Seems as good a guess as any, but it is just that. It's a guess. The best market economy minds in the world have no idea. Just this morning, two competing analysts had the price of oil at $82 and $54 respectively on January 1st, 2016. And the price of oil in May will again affect billions of dollars in North Dakota revenues. Companies again will be hoping for the prices to stay depressed. Many in this building are praying for the price to stay above $55.09. You see, that's the only real number that matters. Oil revenues have become too important to the citizens of North Dakota for us to maintain the trigger in the code. This deal is a fair deal for the state. It stabilizes the tax code and gives both the state and the industry a predictable tax structure that fosters growth, encourages development, and allows the state to budget on a predictable revenue stream.
Senator Oban.
Mr. President, at the beginning of this session, I recall a legislative colleague giving me advice, like many of you have, and to be clear, only some of which has really been appreciated, that the public's perception of what we're doing here matters because perception often becomes reality. I can't help but think about our actions and our decisions, especially in the last few days, how they have appeared to the general public. The day after we passed a bill to build a $5 million house in Bismarck, here we are, voting to cut the oil extraction tax, something established by the very voters who put us here. How out of touch must an average North Dakotan think we've become? The more I thought about the governor's residence bill and this one, the more similarities I found in how I feel we're handling the issues they're attempting to address. I know in each circumstance, in the governor's house, and in yesterday's bill, and in the big trigger in this one, that they need to be rebuilt, that something's broken. On that, we can absolutely agree. But I think what we're willing to give in exchange for those very necessary fixes are unnecessarily excessive. There have been times I think we give ourselves a bit more credit in this chamber than we deserve in our constant claims that we're above how other state legislatures act or how things go in Washington. While maybe in some cases we are, we best be careful about how admirably and honorably we say we go about our business. Frankly, the process we've seen with this bill has been more comparable to some people to the kind of behavior they would expect out of Washington, not out of Bismarck. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. President, but I get the very distinct impression we would hate to be compared to Congress and to Washington. Maybe we should make sure we don't deserve to be. The most obvious and very legitimate problem expressed by the public is the unbridled rush on a bill of this magnitude, and that absolutely deserves recognition in this debate. But I've also thought about the ramifications of passing such short-sighted policy. Calling this short-sighted isn't just something we made up. It's something we actually have numbers to back up, numbers the senator from District 42 referenced. But those numbers will only be of value if this body is willing to admit they exist. Mr. President, the impacts of this bill are a very big deal. During the last election, all of North Dakota heard about a ballot measure deemed a really bad idea. That idea would have taken just 5% of the extraction tax out of our state's coffers. The costs, some estimated, would be over $5 billion over the next 25 years. We learned that, quote, out-of-state special interest groups want to mandate $150 million a year, $3 million a week, taking it away from our money that will be pulled from our schools, our roads, from tax relief, from emergency services and flood protection. A certain majority leader said at that time that he believed that plan was disastrous. To quote, the measure would set aside over its 25-year span billions of dollars that would not be available for elementary and secondary education, higher education, and badly needed infrastructure projects needed throughout the state. Unquote. Oh, the irony. In addition to that majority leader, other opponents of that measure, which again would have removed 5% of the revenue collected from the extraction tax, are the same ones who all of a sudden support removing 23% of the revenue our state collects from the extraction tax. The voters made it crystal clear by a 60-point margin that taking 5% away was a bad idea for North Dakota. Under that same theory, and using my skills as a former 7th and 8th grade math teacher, House Bill 1476 must be a bad idea times almost 5. The lack of popularity for cutting the extraction tax, whether it's by 30% in the long term or 23% in the long term, or apparently even 5% over 25 years, is not because the public doesn't understand this issue. They do. And I'm not much of a betting girl, but I'd be very willing to venture a guess that the 60% of North Dakotans who have opposed these efforts for years, for 3 sessions, as mentioned by the senator from District 34, haven't changed their minds in the 5 days since this bill was introduced. Mr. President, we're supposed to be here representing the public. The public doesn't support this bill, nor the process. And at some point, we need to listen to the public. We can't determine exactly whose predictions are best, or what will happen in the Middle East, or what the price of oil will be, or how that price will affect production, or if the big trigger would go on, and when it would come off if it did. And we all want the best product out of this bill. I hope we're open to making it better if those options come before us. But if 5 days was enough time to propose, introduce, debate, and vote now on a bill that will impact our budgets for generations to come, we certainly have time to take a step away from this overreaction and focus on what we have in common, reforming the trigger while not giving away the farm. Please vote red if this is going to be the final product we're left with today.
Senator Wanzik.
Mr. President, I heard the statement on this floor that what business would give up 20% of their upside just to manage risk? No one would do that. Well, I feel that I'm qualified to comment on this as somebody who's managed a business for his entire life that is based on a commodity. Our finest farmers in this state do that quite often. One thing we farmers understand about a commodity market is you cannot control the market. It is a global market. It is something you have absolutely no control over and no one can predict. There's many times where I've wished that I would have sold more corn for the $5 and $6 price that I had available to me in these last few years. But I didn't do it. I did some. But I got a little greedy, thinking that I want $7 and $8, which I've seen in the market, and which the Chicago Board of Trade told me it was going to be into the future. Well, they were wrong, and I was wrong. I lost a lot of money. Corn is down at the $3 range, and it's at a price where I can't even break even. Farmers do this quite often. And the family farms that survive the test of time through the generations where the farm stays with the family are farms that manage in a stable and steady manner, not the ones that chase the top of the commodity market. That's what I see here. That's what I'm seeing before me. There is an opportunity here for now with the amendments to only give up 0.5% to control the risk on the bottom side. Don't underestimate the bottom side, downside risk. It's not fun when you can't make things, ends meet. Management during these times with a commodity-based business are very important. And our finest farmers in this state do that quite often, recognizing the risk and recognizing their limitations in predicting what the market will do. That's what we're trying to do here, is provide stability when the prices are down, when things are tough. When the prices are high, that won't be as much of a problem. We will have more revenue. We can afford it more at that point in time, where you can afford it when the market is down. Again, don't underestimate the downside risks that we face when we're dependent on a commodity-based industry.
Senator Bekkedahl.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wasn't going to rise and speak on this, but it involves my area too importantly for me not to. I've lived my entire life in Western North Dakota, specifically my city. My family on both sides have been there since homesteading over 100 years ago. I've lived the life of this industry because it's lived with me. I've seen boom and bust cycles in my community, just as we've seen in the state level because of this rise and drop in commodity pricing. The downtimes are not good. We could get there again. I'm told, and I didn't do the math, but I'm told that this trigger bill, since its inception in the 80s, was in effect at one time for 17 years. I lived in my community for those 17 years. There were 17 years of struggle. 43% of our entire city debt being paid to debt, our entire city budget being paid to debt payments because of what happened in the 80s oil bust. Nearly bankrupted my community. There was a lot of uncertainty then. And there's a lot of uncertainty now. I realize the triggers were put in place in a different time and era, and they were put in place with good intentions. And they were put in place to try and mitigate the damages that we all could see from the depressed commodity prices. But from my perspective, having lived this, they didn't do that. And they're not doing it today. What they are doing is creating more uncertainty. I have operators in my area that are saying, do I drill or not drill? Do I frack or not frack? Do I lay off employees, or do I continue to reduce their hours as I'm doing now, trying to retain the great workforce I have now in this environment? Those are questions that come to me, and I wonder, is this really working? And then I get elected to this August body, and I come into this environment, and I hear the same thing. What are we going to do with budgets? Seems to be a lot of uncertainty on this side of the aisle as well. A lot of uncertainty about what are we going to do if we can't fund these things? What happens if the commodity prices get too low? What happens when the money doesn't come in? What do we do about spending needs then? And in my own community, that's gone from a debt level of $32 million in 2011 to $325 million in 2014, and headed to $650 million in 2017. This creates a lot of uncertainty for my community as well. Because when we went through the 80s, we didn't have the state resources to come to our aid and help us out in the situation we were in. We've now had that assistance, and it's been wonderful for my community and the residents in my area. But I have uncertainty about that now because of what sits before us. I've done the math in a little different way. I didn't look at it as what are we giving up in this bill. I did it the other way because, not because I'm a pessimist, but because I want to know what the downside is in this whole situation. At our current 11.5% tax rate, at 1.2 million barrels per day, which is what we were at one point and close to now, at 365 days a year, at $50 per barrel price, which we've been close to most of this time, and it's under the trigger. And a trigger situation not for 17 years as we've already experienced, but for 10 years since that number came out in earlier discussion. The oil extraction tax loss of revenue in that 10 years to the state of North Dakota is $14,235 million. In prior testimony here today, or prior speaking, we've heard the number that the state's going to lose $4 billion at the 10% rate over a decade. So take that $4 billion difference. With the trigger on 10 years, we would still lose $10,235 million. We've talked about the Water Resources Trust Fund and what they do and what they're going to lose. With that $10 billion revenue loss in 10 years, the 20% Water Resources Trust Fund could have had $2 billion. The 20% Common Schools Trust Fund from that extraction tax could have had $2 billion. So I looked at it a little differently, Mr. President. I did the math a little bit differently. Call me a pessimist, but I've lived that other world with 17 years with this in place. And I understand we could just remove the triggers when the industry that has been our partners in growth and development of our state is on the verge of getting the relief that has existed for many years to serve our needs. Just as we could remove all the exemptions to the agriculture industry when it serves our needs as well. But Mr. President, I'm here to partner with industries that benefit our state and its residents, not punish them. This bill involved all the major participants in discussion and hearings, and its passage removes the uncertainty we have all been confronted with. I urge its passage for all our benefits.
Senator Mathern.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Senate. I would like to give a personal face to this debate. Oil and taxes has an impact on many people in our communities. If you, Mr. President, or a family member of yours had prostate cancer or breast cancer, would you go to a state hospital? We all know the answer is no. We've developed a continuum of care for illnesses like cancer. We have cancer screenings, we have clinics, we have hospitals around the state. We catch such problems early, and we provide treatment and care in dignified facilities. We used to keep people in institutions who had leprosy. We figured out a way that that wasn't necessary. We used to do that for people who had tuberculosis. We figured out a way where that wasn't necessary. We have not yet made that progress in mental illness and drug addiction, but we could with the resources that are available to us through proper taxation of the oil industry. There is great need across the state, but mental illness and drug addiction are exacerbated by the demands and consequences of industry, the stress of life in the oil patch, the working conditions, and the difficulty in attracting behavioral health professionals is all part of that challenge. Proper taxation helps us meet that challenge in the same way that proper taxation helps us meet that challenge in transportation and in things like education. Mental illness and drug addiction can be a terminal illness. Like cancer, people die from it. It's a tragedy for families. And no doubt many of the senators here have experienced such a tragedy. The most obvious example is suicide. Our suicide rate over the last 6 years has gone up dramatically. We now have one of the top rates of suicide in the country. Just in our last reporting year, 156 people died of suicide. Mental illness and drug addiction is costly. We need the resources of this bountiful industry. It's costly in our emergency home visits, in our law enforcement and firefighter calls. Our burgeoning prison population and lost work are costs we have documented in many bills this session. We now have 1,700 people in prison. Another 7,000 in parole and probation. Our Director of Corrections has told us that many of these people would not have to be there if they had proper treatment. Many of the people in parole and probation would never go back to prison if they had proper treatment. And we have good news. Mental illness and some of the resources that we've had through the oil industry and proper taxation has brought programs to our state. We have psychotropic medications now. We have behavioral therapies, case management, support services that we didn't have decades ago. This is work. This is proof that treatment works. We just don't have enough in our communities. Over the last couple years, because of the Senate bill to study this system, we came up with a number of reports and elicited consultants. We have a report called the Schulte Report. The first sentence in that report says, the North Dakota mental health and substance abuse system is in a crisis. Further on, it states that services are poor across the state, but the situation is dire in the West. Nevertheless, taking on a can-do posture, groups, along with the legislative interim committees, came up with a plan to address the system and a plan to avert a federal lawsuit by careful strategic changes over the next 3 biennia with the resources that we have available to us. You can look at the plan on the UND Center for Rural Health website, and you can get a copy from me at my desk, and you'll also find other material there that indicates the connection between what goes on in an area of the state and mental illness. I believe that the passage of 1476 takes money off the table to implement this plan over the next 3 biennia. The number of bills that we've had, I've had Legislative Council tally up that came from that interim committee work. Started out with a cost of some $14 million. We have now left $1.6 million. There were additional programs cut from the Human Service budget. Residential addiction beds in Dickinson, North Dakota. Mobile crisis mental health services in all of the oil counties was not funded. Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, and Mr. President, I agree with the grandmother of the senator from District 36, who asked in a letter to the editor just recently, will it really take a lawsuit to wake us up? The consultant who came to our state was not some ivory tower theorist. She was a person with a mental health background. He was a person who served in the Iowa legislature as a Republican. She and all kinds of people around the state called us to action. To a large extent, we have fallen short to make the required changes. Suicides will continue, family tragedy will continue, and our prison system will become even a larger part of our government budget. We can make positive changes to make a full continuum of mental health services and drug addiction services available to all our citizens like we have for other illnesses. But we need the resources. This bill, I believe, brings even greater risk to modernization of our behavioral health system. Please vote no on House Bill 1476.
Senator Bowman.
Mr. President, this has been an interesting discussion because I've been here for a long time and I've listened to all of the experts in this assembly. I guarantee you there's not one person that knows where we'll be 5 years from today with oil. If you want to look at what oil does in North Dakota, get yourself a chart. How many years do you think we've had oil over $50 a barrel? How many years out of the last 40? 7. Up and down, up and down, up and down. So when I hear people talk about how much we're going to lose or how much we have to gain, that's a guess. The best estimate that you can have. What we want to do with the resource that we have is manage it the best that we can with what we have. And the biggest mistake we'll make is once we depend on oil to take care of all of our problems, that's when oil will go south. And then we'll be left with something that we've never seen in this state. We've seen kind of like that in the 80s. I was a part of it. I watched cities go bankrupt because we were going to take all that money from the oil companies. We took it, they left. You have to be careful when you're dealing with business. There's some good arguments on both sides, I appreciate that, but I've heard them all for a long time. Anyone that has the ability to stand up and tell us where we're going to be in 5 years dealing with oil prices, please let me know, because I want you to be my consultant when I invest. But I don't think anybody can do that. I haven't seen it. I haven't heard it. It's all an estimate, and it's all a guess. So let's get down to reality. One thing we know for sure, if we stabilize the tax, we know we're going to have income. There's no guessing game in that. We know there's going to be water projects built because we're going to have an extraction tax collected. Maybe not quite as much as some of us want, but it's going to be there for a long time. I hope you think about that when you decide to vote against this bill, because there's going to be a price to pay someday.
Senator Campbell.
Now, Mr. President, I too was not going to talk, but just a couple quick short comments. It's get to be 6 o'clock. The senator from District 42 commented if gasoline's at $4, how irresponsible it would be with the billions of dollars being lost. Well, if gasoline's going to be $4 a barrel or $4 a gallon, we can all assume that a barrel of oil is going to be over $90. So in effect, the effective tax rate will be 11%. The current effective tax rate now is 11.1%. So it'll be pretty much the same. And the only thing we're changing is eliminating the big trigger, which everybody likes to eliminate that. And if the price stayed in the 80s for 17 years after it's kicked in, it'd be billions and billions of dollars lost. So to me, this is a nice hedge, and I like it. I'm going to support it. And just one little side bit from the senator from District 9 on the Red River Valley land. maybe we could talk a trade afterwards, because right now there's a lot of farmers losing $300 to $1,000 an acre, and we can't go against any trigger or taxes to offset those losses. So let's talk afterward on a trade.
Senator Dotson-Rod.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, I'd just like to make a few comments about the oil tax in the state of North Dakota. I think most of us who've been here for a while understand there are the two taxes, the 5% gross production tax and the 6.5% oil extraction tax. We've got the 5% gross production tax in the 1950s when oil was first discovered here, and it is intended to be a local tax. Its design was to be something of a replacement for taxes on property. We passed House Bill 1176 here yesterday, which had some of the distributions of the 5% tax, the oil and gas impact fund, political subdivisions, distributions to the local areas back in oil country, and other things that are related to that. There is a share of that is state. It's not all local, but generally it is designed and intended to be. And when we see the incentives we have and the triggers, there's very, very little of that works on this 5%. That 5% is really not part of what gets involved here. The 6.5%, the oil extraction tax, was created by the voters in the November election in 1980. The voters passed this, and we've had this oil extraction tax at 6.5% on our law books continuously since 1980. The big trigger was created by the legislature in 1987, and the big trigger did kick in and was in effect for a number of years. The little trigger that we created in 2009 under our current law expires in June of this year. So we've had both of those triggers on the books, and during that time the industry has grown and has prospered and has really done well, and it's been a tremendous benefit to every person regardless of their age in every corner of North Dakota. We have all benefited greatly from the work of the oil industry and having them here. And I think a lot of us feel we've provided a good environment for them to work in, a good regulatory environment, a good tax environment. At this point, North Dakota is number 2 in the nation, and we think that a lot of that is because this has been a good place for them to come and work and grow and prosper. So this tax, that 6.5%, has really not been an element that has hampered growth in the state, and there really is no reason to reduce it. We did hear in testimony in our hearings that many of the people in the industry don't like the volatility. They're worried that trying to plan with this big trigger, whether it's going to happen or not, does create an uncertainty. And I think that they make a good point, and that is a problem which we could solve. We can reduce the trigger mechanism, we can alter it without having to take the 6.5% rate that the voters approved off the table. And this bill will take the 6.5% oil extraction tax to 5%, and it does so in January, and in the out years, if this stays in effect, when you project out and get out a number of years in the future, in the 5 years, 6 years out, it looks like we will see the monthly impact of this lower tax to be about $50 million a month. And it's also true that North Dakota will be generating considerable revenue. So we shouldn't just look at the loss. We are going to be in a good spot, but we will have lost or have reduced the tax rate to the degree that there's going to be $50 million less there. This will also mean that for the Legacy Fund, there'll be $15 million per month less going into the Legacy Fund. We were here 2 years ago and talked about oil and oil taxes, and we had a report that was done by an outside group that was not affiliated with any oil industry company or with any other group. They were an independent company, and they compared the 8 main oil states in the U.S. in terms of their overall tax environment and took into account the differences from one state to another in their other taxes besides their extraction and production taxes. There are property taxes and other taxes. Of the 8 states, North Dakota was in the middle. We were, because it was an even number, there were 2 states in the center of that graph for tax impact. We were, I can't remember if we were number 4 or number 5, but we were in the center in terms of our overall tax environment. So that the 6.5% tax we have now appears to be about right. It's a moderate, middle of the road position. And speaking of the legacy fund, if you look at the legacy fund, it was created in 2010 by constitutional amendment. It currently has $3.1 billion in it. That's as of March. Wyoming, this figure is about a year and a half old, was $6.3 billion. Alaska, they're around $45 billion. And Norway is $882 billion. Of course, they're in a quite an entirely different situation. In Norway, the state owns all the mineral rights, so it's probably not a fair comparison. But our state at $3.1 billion, we are in the early stages of building a fund, the purpose for which has not yet been determined, has not been assigned, and it's not in the law. That money will be there for some future legislature to decide, and it's in the Constitution, so there are some limits on the legislature's ability to get to the legacy fund. I mention the legacy fund because this law and this bill will affect the contributions to the legacy fund. And I think that most everyone that I talk to in the state has been a big supporter of the fact that legacy fund is there, that we are setting aside some of this prosperity for the future. We talked some here in this debate earlier about the commodity prices and how commodity prices can really force management to adjust and change. We have 2 big industries in this state that are heavily dependent. I've heard that the state in general is about 68% dependent on commodity prices. So we are in a situation where swings and volatility are something we've seen over our history. Right now, agriculture, one of the 2 big industries, their prime contributions in terms of taxes are the taxes they pay on income they earn, sales for purchases they buy, and the taxes they pay on property. We've had some recent run-ups in property taxes and values. It appears this is going to be a tough year for many farms. I mentioned the other day that it appears most farms in the state will be paying more in taxes on their property than they will in net farm income by the time this year is over, unless there's something very dramatic that changes. It does not look good. There is no trigger mechanism. There is no reduction for those taxes. They will stay there, and it's going to be, I think, a difficult time for many of us in the legislature and many farm people when we have to deal with each other in December when those statements come out. The oil industry does not pay property taxes. The 5% that's imposed was designed to be an in lieu of tax and in lieu of property tax, and it does provide a benefit in that it will adjust itself up and down as the commodity moves up and down. Most of the problems that have occurred in the oil industry, and it is a boom and bust business. That's been the history of the business, and it's caused by oil prices, commodity prices, and not the tax rate that may be in effect in one state or another. The 80s, we had a big bust here in North Dakota, and it was due to the commodity prices and the fact that the rig count is down today. It's down in North Dakota, and it's down in virtually every state that has an oil industry. This bill that we have in front of us would really be a good bill to introduce at the beginning of a legislative session. I think the process that we have here does not make us look good. I think it's okay to ask for a tax cut. Now, this is a free country, and people routinely ask for tax cuts. And we as lawmakers should look at every reasonable request. But I think that there is a process that we in the legislature normally follow. People come here and lobby us during the 3 months, 4 months we're here. You can even, if you want to, if that doesn't work, you can win public support by getting a bus painted up and travel around the state and try to encourage public support for trying to get your point of view across. And if that doesn't seem to work, then you can use a standard bill process like we had last session to try to achieve a lower tax. But if none of that works, I think this method we have in front of us today to bring a bill in on the 70th day at the end of the session, I think is not a good way to do business. I think if this works, if this becomes the way that you can get something done, you'll probably see more of it. But it appears that the strategy here is to do this quick and do it before the public has a chance to really figure out what's going on, and get it done fast, push this thing through. And I like I said earlier, it would be a good bill to have introduced early in the session, and let's get the data, let's get the financial impact, and let's see how it affects the various people that are in the industry and affected by the tax. We as legislators...
Senator, I'm loath to do this, but it's the Senate rules. Your time elapsed about 30 seconds ago.
Okay. I have a bill I would like to introduce, or an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Are you asking to go to the sixth order?
Yes, I'd like to go to the sixth order, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President.
Senate will be on the sixth order.
The amendments for this bill should be at everyone's desk. You should have a copy. It's amendment number 05020.
Are there any senators who do not have a copy? Ending in 05020. Any senators who do not have a copy of the proposed amendment referenced by Senator Dotson-Rod?
And Mr. President, members of the Senate, this amendment, while it's difficult to read because it shows the lines that go in the bill, and it's not a bill in form, with the words, the Christmas tree or the other version, but it's very simple. If you look at the top of the amendment line where it says page 5 and page 5, there are 2 lines there, that basically restores the rate in the bill to the 6.5% that we currently have. So it basically, if this amendment were adopted, we would have the extraction tax set at 6.5%. And then what it does on page 11, that part of it, if you'll look on where it says page 11, remove the overstrike over the first 75,000 barrels. What this does is it reestablishes or extends our current small trigger. So it puts the small trigger back in effect. It raises our rate to 6.5%. It reestablishes the small trigger, which it runs for 2 years, and that really is what the bill does. It puts us back at 6.5% extraction tax and reestablishes a small trigger. It extends the current 2015 expiration date 2 years to 2017. So if Mr. President, that is the proposed amendment, and I guess if there are any questions, I'd be prepared to answer them. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I was also request a recorded roll call vote on this amendment.
Are there 7 senators willing to stand in favor of Senator Dotson-Rod's request? Very well, we'll proceed when we get to that point on this proposed amendment by way of recorded roll call vote. The Senate is on the 6th order. We are debating. Stand. Senate is on the 6th order. We are debating the proposed amendment, the amendment proposed by Senator Dotson-Rod to House Bill 1476, which was previously amended. Further discussion on the proposed amendment ending in 05020, the amendment proposed by Senator Dotson-Rod on the 6th order. Senator Heckman, just so that I understand, your light was on. Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyone seeking, please have your light on if you seek to debate the proposed amendment only. Senator Cook.
Well, Mr. President, I would hope that we reject this amendment. First off, I'm looking at it real quickly here. Page 5, line 13, remove 4. I believe the bill we have before us has 5 in that position. And then the second thing, it looks to me like the small trigger, it also adjusts the rate of that small trigger, which of course is set to expire at the end of June. But Mr. Chairman, I think as I've been sitting here listening to the debate we've been having, there's some things that just come to my mind. And first off, it's been an honor to serve on the Senate Finance and Tax Committee for the last 6 sessions. And last few of them with the senator from District 26. You don't serve on a tax committee and go to tax meetings without soon coming up with some convictions. And Mr. President, one conviction I have is that tax policy and the economy are connected at the hip. Good tax policy will drive an economy. Bad tax policy will slow an economy. Uncertain tax policy will derail it. Many of you heard me say this before. Good tax policy is fair, it's simple, it's easy to understand, it's easy to administer, it's predictable, and it's certain. Mr. President, when I look at tax policy, I weigh it against those very issues. I have never looked at tax policy to see how much money could I extract out of some taxpayer. That is no reason to judge tax policy. But if you listen to the debate we have here, it appears the goal of some is to extract as much out of an industry as we can. Mr. President, that's bad. That's the wrong tax policy. It's not a cow that we're just going to milk and milk and milk with the hopes that it never goes dry. This industry is the horse that pulls the plow of our economy. And the tax policy and that economy are connected. This industry is what has driven our wages in this state to the point where they are. It's what's brought our unemployment rate down to one of the lowest in the country. It's this industry that's possibly going to build a plastics plant somewhere between Mandan or Minot. It's this industry that's building the fertilizer plant at Jamestown. Mr. President, this industry is driving our economy. 80,000 people they employed. I think they're down to 65. Mr. President, all we need is a good, steady industry out there. We don't need the ups and the tremendous downs that we see, the booms and the busts. We need to keep it stable. And we don't need to milk this cow like it'll never go dry. I would hope that we can reject these amendments.
Reminding the Senate, we are debating a proposed amendment to the previously amended House Bill 1476. We are under the sixth order. Reminding you of that, I'll call on Senator Larson to debate the proposed amendment.
Mr. President, this amendment, I got a question. If we adopt this amendment, will that cause the MHA Nation to pull out of the compact that they are currently in?
I don't know that the question is directed at any particular senator. I'm going to call on Senator Schneider. Your light is on.
Well, Mr. President, if I could just try to respond very quickly to the question from the senator from Minot. I think that's a question that would probably properly be asked of the MHA Nation, a sovereign nation within our state's borders, at testimony given before a committee. I want to also respond to the comments from the senator from Mandan, and I appreciate his comments. If there are technical questions or a 4 is a 5 with regard to these amendments, that's a part of the haste makes waste approach that has marked this bill since last Friday. We just got these floor amendments, Mr. President, a couple of minutes before the debate. Again, not a way to run a railroad in terms of considering this serious measure about tax policy. I do want to rise in support of this amendment. I appreciate the consideration and thought that the senator from Wyndmere, Mr. President, has put into this. And it really asks for a reset of this whole process. If the concern is the trigger, let's take a look at the trigger. And count me as one, Mr. President, that during sustained periods of low prices in the market, which we may be going through right now, although WTI looks pretty good today, during these sustained downtimes in the market, it makes sense to provide some sort of incentive. Again, under this rush process, I'm not sure if we got it perfectly right, but we could adopt this amendment, bring the bill to conference, fix it, and really focus in on the heart of the matter here, and that's reforming the trigger. We don't have to adjust the top rate, the 6.5% extraction tax, in order to reconfigure these incentives. Still leaving a meaningful incentive during downtimes, but also kind of taking out the bluntness of it so it doesn't blow a hole in our state budget once every 2 years. So I appreciate the amendment being offered in that spirit, and I hope that we can get some green lights for it.
Further discussion about the proposed amendment, Senator Dotson-Rod.
Yes, Mr. President and members of the Senate, the chairman of the Tax Committee asked a question about these amendments, and there is a line right underneath the bold-type heading that says, in lieu of the amendments adopted by the Senate, this bill is amended as follows. These amendments cannot coexist on the bill with the amendments we adopted earlier. So if these amendments were adopted, the Senate amendments that we adopted here earlier tonight would go away. These amendments would take their place. So that he is correct that there is a 5 on the bill as it stands right now with the amendments we adopted earlier. But if we adopt these, the appropriate amendment would be the 4.
Senator, it's your position that the language included on your proposed amendment would in fact erase the previous amendment. It'd have the impact of erasing the previous amendment that was adopted by the Senate this afternoon, and then this would go in place of that as though that amendment had never occurred.
That's correct, Mr. President,
Okay.
in accordance with the in lieu language.
Just so that everyone's clear. Further discussion on this proposed amendment to House Bill 1476. Hearing none, we'll proceed by way of recorded roll call vote at the request of Senator Dotson-Rod, supported by at least 7 members of the Senate. Would the Secretary please open the key? All senators record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote, Secretary will close the key. The amendment fails. Returning to the 14th order, continuing to debate House Bill 1476 as previously amended. Senator Heckman.
Mr. President, may we be on the 6th order for purposes of an amendment?
Without objection, the Senate will be on the 6th order. Senator Heckman.
I believe the staff is handing out my amendment right now, so should I wait for that?
Senator, I think that you can proceed. They're going to be handed out. I've got my copy here, and I may interrupt you in a moment to see whether everyone has them, but I think if there's no objection, I think you can proceed with your discussion on your proposed amendment.
Mr. President, I would move Amendment 15.1024.05023 for consideration. Mr. President, this amendment before us places a sunset on House Bill 1476. And the sunset on this bill would allow a study during that time to proceed and provide valuable information for the future of this state. The study will look at the scientific and economic impact of oil and gas recovery techniques, the appropriate levels of tax incentives, and other information that's so important to the state, political subdivisions, industry, and agencies. Mr. President, this bill has blossomed quickly, and as elected officials, it is now up to us to take careful consideration of the consequences of our actions if this bill is to pass. I attended a considerable portion of the testimony in both committee hearings, as well as many of you did. And one thing was very clear. Testimony presented about the impact to the future of this state and to the bill were highly speculative. How many other bills do we pass purely on speculation? In all the committees that I'm in, we're asked for research, for data, for outcomes, and for facts before we pass legislation. And that's why I think it's an incumbent on us to do our duty as elected officials to proceed with the research necessary to make informed decisions before making this or any tax policy change permanent. The amendments that I have here, Mr. President, add Section 9 and 10, which are on page 3 of the amendment. Section 9 is a legislative management study on oil and gas tax incentives. And Section 10 is an appropriation, the sum of $300,000, for Legislative Council to conduct the scientific and economic information and the study regarding oil and gas recovery and enhanced recovery techniques. So there's a couple of portions on here that I think are really important to the future of North Dakota, and a study will get us to where we need. And the expiration date will allow us to gather that data in 2 years. If we're correct on what we're doing right now, then fine. And if we're not and we find other information, then this will allow us to proceed with that correct information before making these important decisions. The study before us, I feel, is just plain common sense. The sunset on the bill is logical to allow the time to study the issue. And I would ask the members of this chamber to vote yes on this amendment. And Mr. President, I would ask for a recorded roll call vote on this amendment.
Are there 7 senators willing to stand in favor of the request for a recorded roll call vote? Very well. At the appropriate time, we'll proceed by way of recorded roll call vote as to approval or not of the proposed amendment. Senator Cook.
Mr. President, I would ask that we could reject these amendments also. They were offered in committee. Both of them were, the sunset and the study. The sunset, I don't think helps anything for certainty. So I would ask that we could reject these amendments also.
Further discussion on this proposed amendment to House Bill 1476 as previously amended. Hearing none, that is the question. We'll proceed by way of recorded roll call vote on the proposed amendment to House Bill 1476. Would the Secretary please open the key? Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote? Secretary will close the key. The amendment fails. Returning to the 14th order, House Bill 1476 as previously amended. Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, that last one went a little faster than I expected, and I didn't want to pass mine out until that one was done so that we didn't get confused, but I have an amendment going around, and I think I will take the opportunity to just stand for 1 minute while they go around, if I may.
In the meantime, are you asking to go to the 6th order, Senator?
That would be a fabulous idea. Thank you.
Senate will be on the 6th order for purposes of an amendment.
Okay. And, Mr. Chairman, I guess I could say that I move Amendment 15.1024.05024.
If there is any senator who does not get a copy of that as they're being handed around, please, let's be old-fashioned. Just raise your hand and we'll get one to you. Yeah, they're okay. That was a test run. Good. That's good. That's what we're gonna do. But first, we're gonna pass them out, and then. But no, good instincts on that. Good.
You know, Mr. President, if this is going to take a little while, why don't I just go back to whatever order we're supposed to be on in general, and I could discuss the bill generally and hold the amendment for a moment, if that would work.
We could do that. There were no lights on for further debate under the 14th order. We don't have a copy yet.
Okay.
All right. We're going to get them. Let's just wait a minute, Senator Triplett. I don't know that there were any other senators wishing to be recognized under the 14th order. We have been at this for a while, and we've all been drinking water. Judging by the condition of the President of the Senate, perhaps we should stand down for a couple of minutes anyway. So why don't we do that? We'll stand down for just a matter of minutes. It won't be more than a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes.
Mr. President, may we stand in recess for 5 minutes, please?
Good enough. Is there a second? I don't know. All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. The Senate will be in recess for 5 minutes. The Senate will return to order. We are on the sixth order. Senator Triplett has the floor. I believe that the proposed amendments have been handed out. They're ending in 05024. Are there any senators who do not have a copy of the proposed amendment being offered by Senator Triplett? Senator Triplett, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. As with the previous amendments, these are in the format of in lieu of amendments. And I just want to say, this was not our idea. This is apparently how they are supposed to be drafted. So they're difficult to read, and you're just going to have to trust us that we're telling you what's different as we trust the folks upstairs who drafted them. The intention of this amendment is very simple, Mr. President. If you look where it says page 5, line 29, and at the end of that it says insert immediately thereafter of $80. And then if you move down to where it says page 6, line 1, and at the end of that section it says of $80. We are changing up that one number on the reverse trigger so that instead of the $90 per barrel of oil that is in the bill as it is now before you, it would be changed to 80. I'm going to explain to you where that came from. It is the halfway point between 70 and 90. I was never a math teacher, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. $70 represents a number that would have made the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation more comfortable with this bill. And I'm going to spend a few minutes, Mr. President, explaining why that's important. Some of you are sort of new here, so I'm going to start from a ways back. Not with a lot of technical detail, but just the overview. In the 1980s, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case which clarified that Indian tribes and state governments were both equally entitled to apply the full amount of their existing taxes on lands inside the exterior boundaries of an Indian reservation within a state. What that means is that the MHA nation, which I believe had a tax of 5%, and our state, which had a top rate of 11.5%, could have happened that there would be a tax of those combined totals on the reservation. And so, until there was a compact between the tribes and the state, there was no oil development for 27 or 28 years, I'm not sure exactly. For a good long time, there was no oil development, including the opening years of this amazing oil boom. Industry, of course, wanted access to the area within the reservation because, as you all know now, it is squarely in the heart of the Bakken. The state certainly wouldn't have minded that there were oil development there because we would get a part of the tax. The tribe was interested in having oil development there because they would get some revenues. But the industry didn't want to go there if they had to pay the sum total of both taxes. And so the executive branch of our government, the legislature, and the tribal council got together and put together a piece of legislation which authorized the executive branch to enter into a tribal compact with the MHA nation to come together and make an agreement. And the legislature at that time didn't put too many restrictions on what the agreement should look like, except a general sense that we would share a regulatory structure, that the tax dollars would all run through our state tax department, and significantly, the most significant piece, that the top rate of the tax would not exceed our top rate of 11.5%. Okay? And the governor and our state tax commissioner negotiated with the tribes and came up with an agreement. It was first signed in 2008, I believe. It was amended with the permission of the legislature in 2013. It is still in effect. It has a provision that says either party can withdraw within 30 days, with 30 days notice to the other side. The industry doesn't want the tribe to withdraw. The state doesn't want the tribe to withdraw. The tribe doesn't even very much want to withdraw, but they are concerned and they have issues. And you heard the carrier of the bill say at the beginning of this presentation that he asked the current tribal chairman if he was okay with this bill. And I was there when that happened, and I have a slightly different rendition of it. It was a black and white question. The question that the carrier and the chairman of our committee asked was, if you had a choice between the bill as it was originally written or the bill in the form that we have it now, which would you take? So there weren't a lot of options offered. And the tribal chairman very reluctantly, after a long pause and without much conviction, said, that the bill as it was first presented was a pretty bad bill, and the bill that we had worked up in committee was better. But that doesn't mean they're happy about it. And you know what? I asked some questions of the bill's sponsors when we were in the committee about the effect of our change of the law on the tribal agreement. And there weren't really clear answers. I asked the sponsor of the bill, the prime sponsor of the bill, if he had consulted with lawyers before he drafted his bill about what might happen with this agreement. And he said no, despite the fact that he, as the majority leader of that other chamber across the hall, has access to quite a number of lawyers in our legislative council office. There are lawyers in the tax department, there are lawyers down the hall in the Attorney General's office. And he very freely acknowledged that he discussed this with none of them. There are implications, Mr. President, and I think they are serious because the industry doesn't want to have two separate tax rates. For one thing, there are quite a lot of wells out there already that have 1 mile of their lateral off the reservation and 1 mile of their lateral on the reservation. There are wells that have 1 mile of their lateral on Indian reservation trust land and 1 mile of their lateral on Indian reservation fee land. And if I haven't entirely lost my place, I'm going to share a few of the words from the existing document, which is entitled Oil and Gas Tax Agreement between the three affiliated tribes in the state of North Dakota. On page 2, it says, for purposes of this agreement, if I may read and quote from this, Mr. President, just briefly, for purposes of this agreement, the following provisions apply. Number 1, the total tribal and state tax rate attributable to production and extraction of oil from trust lands must not exceed 11.5%. But you know what? It doesn't say what happens if we lower our rate, and they choose not to. Moving on to page 4, section E, subsection 3. It says, and I'm quoting, the state and tribes agree to the imposition of the taxes at the rates set forth in this agreement. Neither party will adjust, raise, or lower the production and extraction taxes on oil and gas activities within the exterior boundaries of the Fort Berthold Reservation during the term of the agreement. Period. End of quote. Okay? That's a legal document, and it's binding on us. And if we do something that they don't like, it seems to me they have a choice. They can either say, okay, that was a pretty badly drafted agreement, and it doesn't say we have to go down when you go down. So please go ahead and just keep on collecting the taxes for us. Keep on doing the regulatory things that we've agreed you should do, and send us the money, but please send us 11.5% because we're not going to reduce ours. And I think they could do that. The other thing they could do is they could say, wait a minute, we have an agreement that you're not going to reduce it during the term of this agreement. So the agreement's off. The whole agreement is off. I asked those questions in committee, Mr. President, of sponsors of the bill, the majority leaders of both houses, and I did not get an answer. I asked the question of our primary code reviser who drafts all these amendments for us, he thought there was a problem, and he didn't have an answer. I asked the question of the lawyers in the tax department, and they confirmed that nobody'd ever put the question to them. And since they're special assistant attorneys general, and the attorney general has to defend whatever it is we do here, Mr. President, they weren't inclined to give me an answer. So we have a problem, folks. And if the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation doesn't like what we do here today, we have a big problem. It's going to mess up the regulation, it's going to mess up what the industry wants to do, and it proves the point that all of my mates have been making here, that this is a bill that was pushed through way too fast, without enough consideration, without enough thought, without enough legal analysis. So this amendment that I have brought, Mr. President, goes some way toward making the tribes happier. They're not going to be happy because this is not what they wanted. They still have quite a number of other issues, but moving the number from 90 down to 80 on the reverse trigger will help. I think y'all ought to consider voting for this one.
Reminding the Senate we are debating the proposed amendment ending in 05024. Further discussion on that proposed amendment to House Bill 1476. Senator Sinner.
Mr. President, I forgot to ask for the recorded roll call vote, which I would ask for.
Are there 7 senators wishing to stand in favor of that request? Very well. At the appropriate time, we'll proceed by way of recorded roll call vote. Senator Sinner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to also notify the body that today is a pretty important day in my life. Brought into this world George Sinner by my father, George Sinner. And today is the feast of St. George. So a little levity for the crowd. Mr. President, I rise in support of the proposed amendment with a trigger price of $80. I want to say that I would honestly prefer $70, and if that, I could probably support this bill. But I do support this amendment because I think our tribal friends deserve better than they have been treated during this process. But I want to tell you a little story today. Earlier this week, I called my brother Joe. My brother Joe is a petroleum engineer in Wyoming. Got his master's from one of the premier engineering universities in this country, located near Palo Alto, California. Graduated with honors. My brother Joe is still a petroleum engineer that works on getting the oil out of the ground. But almost all of his classmates today are either CEOs or CFOs of major oil companies or investment bankers for the energy industry. And he told me to call a couple of his friends to talk about this tax and this issue. And I want to tell you some of the things that I learned. One of the things I learned was that most of the major oil companies have hedged their production into 2015 and have seen very little hurt and won't see any hurt until 2016, when their modeling shows that the prices will recover into the 70s. Another thing that I learned, Mr. President, was that our tax policy has absolutely nothing to do with global oil prices, with the current environment we are in, and also I learned that it has very little to do with the cost of production. And I was told that North Dakota's taxes estimate about 2 to 3% of the costs. I learned something else. I learned that the primary reason for the drop in global oil prices is because of the increased production in the United States. Did you hear that? Now, I'm not advocating that we cut back on production. As a matter of fact, I'm advocating just the opposite. But over the past 2 months, the major country in the Middle East has increased their production by an amount similar to what our Bakken Formation can produce totally on a daily basis 1.2 million barrels over the past 2 months. And guess what else has happened over the past 2 months? The price of oil has been increasing. So what does that tell us? What are the economics of that? That tells us that world demand is increasing. I also learned that nearly every one of these high-powered, high-priced gentlemen told us that all of them would take a bet that our trigger will not go into effect. And based on the current futures market, and everybody knows it, I passed out a little sheet about the price today, that trigger will not go into effect. And if it does, if by chance it does, it will be in effect for the minimum 5-month period. I asked these investment bankers in the energy industry, what can we do to help this industry? What can we do? One of the things we can do is get the export ban lifted. That would mean approximately $5 to $7 a barrel. And I know we're all going to say that there's this president in Washington that's causing the problem. Well, that's true today. But that ban was put in place by a Republican president and stood through 5 more Republican administrations. And in fairness, there have been 3 Democrats during that period as well. The second thing he said, we need more pipelines. That would mean approximately another $5 a barrel. Again, a problem with the guy that's sitting in the White House. Well, if we had the Keystone XL and it wouldn't be done today and wouldn't help our situation today, we would be able to ship an extra 100,000 barrels of our 1.2 million through that. Not a big help in this time of down prices. In fact, many people say, all of the economists and the engineers say it wouldn't be done today anyway. I asked him, what else do we see in the future? What else is there? He said, well, you know, George, there are only 2 facilities in the United States that can process the light crude that comes out of your Bakken Formation. Every place else you send it, it has to be blended. Those 2 facilities, those 2 refineries are in our largest West Coast city. Only one way to get there, one railroad. One railroad has a monopoly. Currently, there's a pipeline going to Wyoming where there is 2 new hubs being built that will go directly into that major city on the West Coast. Those things will help. So where are we today, Mr. President, members of this body? According to these economists and investment bankers, today's valuations on all the major oil companies are based on guess what price of oil? $80. $80 is what was used to value their stock. What does that mean? What does that mean? Based on the modeling of the 2 major energy investment banking firms in this country, within 24 months, the West Texas Intermediate price will be somewhere between $70 and $85. Oh, you say, anyone can model and come up with any number. That's true. That is very true. So I ask, what numbers are we using here in this model? Who has come up with these numbers? Early in the session, I asked for a fiscal note on another bill. It was pretty simple. I did a calculation, and the calculation on my fiscal note was $100,000 a year. Guess what? The agency came back with He said that the fiscal note on my bill and my amendment to that bill was $3 million. And I said, why? Well, we have to figure this fiscal note on the lifetime cost of this amendment. So folks, it can be done. We can make estimates. This bill is not a great bill. This is a good amendment, and I'm going to support the amendment. I believe the reason we do not have a long-term fiscal note on this bill is because the backers of this bill really do not want the public to know what the true cost is to our state. Please, please, pass this amendment and lower this cost to our citizens.
Further debate on the proposed amendment to House Bill 1476 as previously amended. Senator Cook.
Mr. President, I would hope that we could reject these amendments. I want to speak a little bit to the amendments and the comments by the senator who offered them, senator from District 18. First off, what she said, pretty much what she said, I agree with all of it, except the comment on the question I did ask the chairman of the MH Nation, as I recall it, and there's a tape of it, so this is just trivial, but I do recall asking the question, would you like the current law that we have in place today, or would you like the law we would have if this bill passed? And he said this bill passed. But there was a reason why I asked that very question that way, is because what really started this whole thing rolling is when the nation came in to the legislature and says, if we have to face these triggers, these big triggers, we will break the agreement. They wanted us to get rid of the big triggers. And that's what generated the discussion of this bill. The senator is right about the conversations we had regarding the legal ramifications of this bill. I had already been made aware that because of the agreement and because of this bill and another bill out there, Senate Bill 2226, that we had a possible challenge, more caused by what we did with 2226, which would require all agreements to be approved by the legislature every 2 years. And of course, this would not meet that. If they had to change this agreement, they'd have had to wait for 2 years. So we have an amendment on this agreement that makes it clear that if the agreement needs to be redone, subject to approval of this bill, that it is not subject to the conditions of Senate Bill 2226. We solved that issue. It is possible that they will still break the agreement. It was possible before the bill was introduced that they could break the agreement. Mr. President, nobody wants them to break the agreement. The industry does not want to, the state should not want to, and the tribe doesn't want to. But Mr. President, nobody else wants $80. The industry doesn't want $80 either. Mr. President, as we worked to craft this bill and to get it in the form that it is before you today, there were a lot of players involved. A lot of players are going to be affected by it. The tribe, the state, and the industry. Nobody's happy, but nobody's happy. Nobody got everything they want. Nobody's really bad. The tribe will take it. It's better than what we had. I hope they don't break the agreement. The consequences of that, I don't think none of us want to see. But I would ask that we reject these amendments. We did amend it have amendments offered in committee at 70. They were rejected in committee. I should also say that as we started this, the industry wanted this at 100. And they have already given up. They've gone down to 90. They agreed at 90. Now at the last moment, we're trying to take it down to 80. The industry does not want this agreement. Please reject it.
Further discussion on the proposed amendment to House Bill 1476. Hearing none, we'll proceed by way of recorded roll call vote. The question being the proposed amendment ending in 05024. Secretary, please open the key. Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote, Secretary will close the key. The amendment fails. Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, are we back on the 14th
We're
order
back
now?
on the 14th order. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, we're back on the 14th order, debating House Bill 1476 as previously amended. Senator Triplett.
Thank you. I don't have prepared remarks here, but I just want to respond to some of the things that others have said during this debate. But first, I want to talk a little bit about my participation in the committee process. I serve on the Senate Finance and Tax Committee, and I agree with everything that has been said by members of the minority party about the process. I'm not going to repeat it because it's getting late and I don't think anyone wants me to repeat it. But I am going to tell you some additional facts, just briefly, about the timeline of our work. As you all know, this bill was filed Friday, April 17th, late in the day. It was scheduled for a joint hearing Monday morning at 9 a.m. before the Senate and House Finance and Tax Committees. I objected pretty vigorously to the majority leader, and I want to say thank you for the fact that he did reconsider that decision and agree that we should have two separate hearings. I think that was enormously important in having at least as much of a debate as we have been able to have. We would not have had such a thorough debate if we had had to have one joint hearing, because issues were brought up and we at least had a few hours overnight to respond. Then our hearing in the Senate Finance and Tax Committee was scheduled the following day on Tuesday, and we were told by our chairman that we better have any amendments that we wanted by 2 o'clock in the afternoon because the bill was going to be out of committee by the end of the day. As it happened, that didn't happen because the hearing ended up lasting longer than expected, and so it got put off until the next day. And then that was Wednesday, which is yesterday, and we've had a few issues, and so here we are on Thursday. So we've actually had 6 calendar days, I guess, and about 3 work days to work on this. Not anywhere near enough for the issues that are included in this bill, Mr. President. Not even close. The majority leader on the other side, who is the prime sponsor of this bill, repeated over and over again to both committees that this topic has been discussed vigorously in the halls and by the media and in the eating places all over town all session long, and therefore that should be enough. Well, you know what? It's not enough. Casual conversations up and down the hallway do not substitute for the focused conversations that are had inside of committees when you sit and look at the language of a line or a paragraph and discuss with attorneys and experts and stakeholders what it means. This is wrong. But
Senator,
I'm going to stop.
I would ask you to confine your remarks
that was the
to
last
bill that's before the Senate.
Okay, that is
it
the
was
last.
the last, but it shouldn't have happened. So please don't continue on that line.
So my point, Mr. President, is that as a member of the minority party, I had a choice to make about whether to sit on my hands and just let a bad bill stay bad or whether to participate. And I made the choice to put all of my energy into trying to make this as good a bill as I could, along with the rest of the members of the committee. And I will say I think we've done a heck of a job. I think that we have made this bill so much better than it was when it started, but it's still not good enough, as you can see by the amendment, just the single amendment that I proposed that we have not answered here or responded to. So I want to take just a few minutes. I will say I did vote for the amendments and the bill in committee because it was better than the bill, and so I'm in favor of improvements.
Senator, so that we're clear, this is your second time up on the bill, however, though. So you have 5 minutes.
Very good. I will talk as fast as I can.
Which is now dwindled down to a half a minute.
Oh dear. Okay. Well,
I'll give you 1.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I do appreciate. Okay. You know, maybe I'd just like to talk then, if I have a short time, about the Norwegian experience. It's been mentioned here before. The Norwegians have something they call the 10 Commandments of their oil tax policy. I'm just going to talk about two of them. One of them is about values, about setting out your values before you start. And I would say that's what the people of North Dakota did in 1980 when they put this extraction tax in place. They said, you know what? A piece of this belongs to all of us. It's a non-renewable resource, and we're going to appropriate it to the people of North Dakota, and they did that. And we should not take that away. Everything that's been done since, in terms of all the tax policy that we've made and all the exemptions, have been done by the legislature in response to difficult time periods in our economic history. So they are two wholly separate issues, and if we want to respect the people of this state, as well as the Indians and the industry, we need to start from the perspective that that 6.5% stays in place. The second thing I want to talk about from the values perspective, that the Norwegians have, that has really impressed me, is always know as much or more as the industry. Mr. President, we have failed utterly. We have failed utterly as a group, and I put myself in that category because I voted for some of these exemptions that are so bad. So getting rid of all of these exemptions is a good thing, and that's why I voted in favor of the bill in committee. But Mr. President, if I may now, I would ask that we divide the question, and I would ask that the bill consist, when we vote, all of the bill as Division A, Section 3, Division B.
One moment. Senator, I did not have a hard copy in my possession at that time. Can you please restate so that I can just physically mark it and then make sure that we all have a clear understanding what your proposed division would be?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. The entire bill, with the exception of Section 3, would be Division A, and then Section 3 would be Division B.
Okay, pretty straightforward. Division A being the entirety of the bill except Section 3, Section 3 being Division B. I'll need a moment, since this was not brought to my attention beforehand, to rule on whether I deem the bill divisible in the fashion that's been proposed by Senator Triplett. One moment, please. The President believes that the bill is divisible in the fashion that is proposed by Senator Triplett. If it is unclear, is it unclear to any senator, the divisions? B is Section 3. A is the remainder of the bill. Okay. What's that? Oh, to do it, yeah. The Senate will have to go to the sixth order to proceed on these two divisions. of the bill. Senator, I've correctly stated again your division. There's no quarrel with that. Okay. That is the explanation to the Senate. We're going to divide them and vote on them separately. We'll proceed by way of, we're under the 14th order, so we're going to have to proceed by way of recorded roll call vote on each of the divisions, is my understanding. Anyone have a different understanding of that? Because that's what's required for the whole. So to vote on the particular divisions, we'd have to proceed by way of recorded roll call vote. First, we'll vote on, and again, hold on one second. We're on the 6th order. We're going to proceed to decide, again, so that everybody's clear, we're in the 6th order. We're going to determine what you will later vote on. You are not voting on the final vote on the bill right now. You'll be voting on what is remaining in the bill that will be considered by the Senate. Does everyone understand that? So we're going to vote on Division A, and then we're going to vote on Division B. And one, both, or none of those divisions will remain for you to then consider under the 14th order. Senator Murphy thinks this is easy. All right. The first question being, under the 6th order, does the Senate wish to retain the language of Division A in the bill itself going forward? Does the Senate wish to retain or keep the language of Division A in the bill? Would the Secretary please open the key? Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote, Secretary will close the key. By a vote of 47 yea, no senators voting nay, Division A is retained for consideration by the Senate. Same question as to Division B, which is Section 3 of the bill in front of you. The question being, does the Senate wish to retain the language of Division B in the bill, House Bill 1476? Will the Secretary please open the key?
Mr. President.
Senator Cook.
Well, Mr. President, I would certainly hope that we vote green on this. This is pretty much the same thing. We'll do the same thing as amendment that we had earlier. This will put the extraction tax back up to 6.5%. It'll eliminate the reverse trigger. So please vote green.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, the question is, does the Senate wish to retain the language of Division B in House Bill 1476? Would the Secretary please open the key? All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote, Secretary will close the key. By a vote of 33 senators voting yea, 14 senators voting nay, Division B is retained. We'll return to the 14th order. The Senate now has before it the same bill. None of the divisions have been removed. House Bill 1476, as previously amended, we are under the 14th order. Senator Dever.
Mr. President, I may have a conflict in that I think I might be unique in that I have thoroughly enjoyed the last 2.5 hours of this debate.
You're out of order.
Well, I think it's great. I would never profess to the eloquence that I've heard from the various speakers today, and they all seem to have at least one thing in common, and I think they're all in support of good financial stewardship. So I agree with all of them on that point. I think we may have a different definition of what good financial stewardship is. And as I think of the history of the Bakken, you know, the first well was drilled in 2006, and we passed a tax incentive to encourage that in 2007 and extended that in 2009. But throughout that, on the majority side, as we've constructed budgets, the big buzzword has been sustainability, because what happens if things do what things are doing right now? Where are we if we've expanded our budgets to a point that we can't sustain that? And throughout that, the other party has been critical of us and said, we have these different groups out there that are hurting and we've got money in the bank. So I think along with sustainability comes certainty, and that's what this bill's all about. I voted for a similar bill in the last session when when the price of oil was high because I thought it was good policy. And then it became political when it went over to the other chamber, and then it failed there. So now here we are discussing a similar kind of proposal, and yeah, I would have preferred that it would have started earlier in the session, so there would have been more time, but we vote on the bills that come before us, and that's where we're at now. So I'm going to support this because I think it provides certainty. I think it's good policy. I think that it keeps the tax structure at a point where all the people of the state still benefit from it. I think there's basically 3 reasons why oil is doing business in North Dakota. And there are other states that have every bit as much potential as North Dakota has. One of those reasons is because we are a business-friendly and responsible state in the stewardship of that resource. The second reason is because you punch a hole, you hit oil. And the third reason, I think, is because our tax policy is not the lowest in the nation, but reasonable. So I think going forward, we need to be concerned about all 3 of those. And I think this is a big part of that, continuing that reasonable tax structure, still at the benefit of the state, but it certainly makes looking at future budgets a lot more certain. And Mr. President, I think we pass this bill, we don't need to save 5 days. We can sit here and talk a little bit longer. But it's been great because this is what the policy, the process is all about. So the debate has been great from my perspective, and I think it kind of puts to rest the argument that we haven't thoroughly vetted the bill, because we certainly have in the last 2.5 hours. So, Mr. President, I'm going to support the bill, and I would hope that others would too.
Senator Axness.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also want to thank the comments from the previous speaker, because as I've been listening to the debate that's gone on for quite a while now, I've been hearing a lot about prices and about taxes, and one thing that has been missing from this debate has been the climate in which this state has allowed this industry to develop. And a climate in which does have a financial impact to our revenues, and I want to touch on that briefly. We allow flaring at 30%. That does have a financial impact to the state. We reduce fines on companies that have broken our laws. We have other tax incentives. We just worked on one right now for sales tax exemption on pipelines. We don't make the oil more stable before we load it into a train and ship it through our communities. Other states do these things. So we do have incentives for the industry to be here beyond the fact that we simply have the oil under our ground. And Mr. President, those incentives do have a big impact, outside of just the tax structure. And it's the incentives to come to North Dakota because we have rules that we do not enforce and we have fines that we do not collect. And we talk about budgets, and the chairman of the Senate Finance and Tax talked about trying to extract as much money from the industry as we can. But what was not mentioned was the dramatic impacts that certain parts of our state are facing because of that industry. And we welcome the industry here. We are happy that they are here to extract our resources if it's done responsibly. But they also have a responsibility to make sure that they are helping the state be able to afford to address the impacts caused by their development. And that's why I am opposed to this bill when we are reducing the extraction tax by 23%. This bill was debated over 5 days. I spent more times in a conference committee debating on $25,000 for traumatic brain injury services. $25,000. This has the potential to impact revenues by billions of dollars. We have had a nice debate here. I actually have enjoyed it. I disagree with the previous speaker on how to vote on the bill, obviously, but members of the Senate, this is perhaps the defining moment of the 64th session. You know, we're going to push a key here probably in the next few minutes. And it is going to set the course of the state for the next decades. And some say that this bill, as it is now, is a compromise. But I'm here to tell you that I am not willing to compromise billions of dollars for the next generation in a span of 5 days. That's why I'm voting no. We have seen efforts to take away the trigger, which was really everything that we agree on. The trigger is what's got to go. We don't agree on lowering the tax that the people of this state set. I'm going to be voting no. I hope that you will join me and that we can come back and take care of this again. And I will remind you that as far as the trigger goes, the prices are headed in the right direction right now. Please help me in defeating this bill.
Senator Wardner.
Mr. President, I've heard a lot here in the last 2.5 hours. But I really want to stay on point. There was a lot of the discussion that was off point. Actually, as we take a look at this particular piece of legislation and policy that we are looking to put in place, I'm going to say less is more. You're going to say, what? Yeah, the lower tax rate is going to mean more to the state of North Dakota. We have talked about the word stability and predictability, and we've kind of been laughed at. But the fact is that when the industry takes a look at where they're going to invest their dollars, they look around the United States and they say, where are we going to be able to have the stability to make the profits that we need to reinvest into the business? We are not the only shale formation on the continent. And we are competing with shale activities in other parts of the country. But when you have investment from the industry, you have more exploration, more research, which picks up the drilling activity, and there's another thing that's coming about: enhanced recovery. I want to remind you, Mr. President, that in the Bakken play, we are recovering probably 7-8% of the oil from the shale at best. That means there's at least 90% more to go. And we're looking for that investment to come into the state and find a way to unlock that oil that's down there in the shale. And it's going to take more investment. If we invest, it's going to mean more jobs. More jobs in North Dakota. There is going to be an increase in production. Price isn't the only thing that leads to money in state revenues. Production does too. We want to keep the production high. And when we do, we have an increase in the state's economy. And one of the funds that really funds our basic priorities, and I've heard a lot about human services and education and infrastructure, the general fund. The more people we have, Mr. President, working and buying things and selling things in our state, that means the general fund is going to increase. We forget about that side. And when we talk about we're going to lose billions and billions and billions, don't forget there's a risk side. We may miss the bullet this time, and we may not trigger the incentives. But if they do, they wipe out in a short period of time all of the gains that you've had before. And I want to tell you, Mr. President, as long as the price of oil is high, the 11.5% total is not a problem. It's when you get down below $65 a barrel that it makes a difference. And we're experiencing that right now in this state. The slowdown has been dramatic. And if we want to keep the activity at an optimum at those prices, we need to make sure we have a tax rate that encourages the industry to invest. We talk about the oil inventories in the world. One speaker talked about there's more use of energy. That may be, but also the inventories are very high, and it looks like it's going to be a while before we really jump up above the $80 a barrel. We've got a lot of investment, and we need more investment. And Mr. President, if we want to be able to take care of our resources out there, the gas and stuff, we need to keep these companies here investing and collecting that so it isn't flaring. So, Mr. President and members of the Senate, this is a responsible bill. It is a responsible bill, and it will serve the people of this state very well. One last comment. I was there, and you probably say, well, you're as old as Methuselah, but I'll tell you what, I was there in 1980 when we voted on Measure 6. And I lived through the boom and the bust of the 80s and what happened in our town. And I'll tell you what, we couldn't get off of that 11.5 fast enough. And we put in these triggers in the late 80s. And we had to live with them for a long time. And that could happen again. We need a predictable and stable tax. Vote green on the bill.
Further discussion, Senator Schneider.
Mr. President, I thank the Majority Leader for his comments and his contribution to the very exciting and historic debate here tonight. Just a few points in response. Regarding the notion that a lower tax rate may result in more revenue, where was the testimony on that? Why couldn't we have had Moody's Analytics come in, do an analysis for us, see if a lower tax rate has actually resulted in more revenue, a cause and effect relationship between those two things, Mr. President? We pay Moody's an awful lot of money. We didn't hear anything from them over the course of less than a week that we've been considering this bill. So I'm not sold that lower tax rates are going to always equate to lower revenue as a cause and effect matter. Secondly, Mr. President, the fact that this is sold as something that brings stability, we are a very small ship on a rocky international geopolitical sea. The instability that we are struggling with here in this state was caused by decisions made in Riyadh. To think that state tax policy is going to somehow have an effect on that instability when it's driven by geopolitics is fanciful. Regarding the notion that we might miss the bullet this time, the trigger may not go off this time. What if we miss the bullet under this bill? That 23% cut to the extraction tax, that goes into effect anyway. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And finally, the sort of argument that Measure 6 caused the oil industry to leave North Dakota in the 80s. And I remember a lot from the 80s, Mr. President. I was basically in single digits for most of that decade. But from what I've learned, and from what I know under this most recent boom, that 6.5% extraction tax was in place when they all came back. There was a little bit of a movement, kind of fizzled right away, Mr. President, back in the 2011 session. Fix the tax. Think how much we've collected in extraction taxes since 2011. You can't fix what isn't broken. Let's keep North Dakota a strong leader when it comes to oil production in this country.
Senator Sinner.
Mr. President, Been a lot of talk about history, about 1980, the election of 1980, and the imposition of this extraction tax. I remember it. I voted for it, and I'm proud of my vote. But also in the 1980s, we elected a new president, a new governor, a new U.S. senator, a new secretary of state. We re-elected a state auditor, and we elected a new insurance commissioner, a new attorney general, and a new ag commissioner. All of those from the same party. 4 years later, well, let's go 2 years later. And let's go to the 1981 session first. In the 1981 session, after those taxes were passed, this legislative body...
Mr. President, this isn't about the bill.
Yes, it is.
This is about history. I object to this. Let's get to the point of the bill.
Mr. President, I'd like to weigh in as well.
I've got an idea. Could the majority leader and minority leader come forward, please? I have a comment I'd like to pass along to both of you at this time. Thanks. Senator, can you, you're on deck. Senator Sinner, the President is taking the Majority Leader's objection under advisement, as they used to say to us in court, because I just have a feeling you're going to get right back to the bill. I just know it.
Mr. President, thank you very much. That's exactly what I'm going to do. This bill changes based on the projections that we have seen, the revenue stream for the next 10 years. And based on the numbers that the Minority Leader gave a few hours ago, our state stands to lose over the next decade somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. And I want to remind this body, that my home sits in District 46. And I want to remind this body that District 46 is probably the most flood-prone district in the state of North Dakota. And I want to remind this body also that 22% of this state's population reside in Cass County, my home. And I want to remind this body that 22% of that money that you are voting away today belongs to those residents. That money would pay for a flood protection project that we desperately need. In January, I was notified that my house, my home, my property is now in the flood zone. I've also been notified by the city of Fargo that within the next 5 years, Fargo and the city is going to be recertified again, and the level will go up 3 more feet. What does that 3 more feet do, my friends? There are 20,000 more homes in my city will be in the flood zone. This money we're voting away today could pay for that project and could bring relief to about 25,000 to 30,000 homeowners in Fargo. What else does this give away? To the residents of my county, we need a fresh water source. We need it desperately. I lived in that county in the 1980s. And guess what happened? The Red River was within a week of drying up. If that were to happen today, my friends, massive numbers of people would be without water because the population has grown so dramatically. We need a fresh water source. We have made promises in this legislative session, my friends. Mr. President, we have promised property tax relief. We have promised property tax reform. And to date, we've been able to deliver that. But we are on the precipice also of a very bad year in agriculture. And that's where I was going with my previous comments, Mr. President, to talk about agriculture in the 1980s. At the same time, we saw a downturn in our economy, in our oil, in our energy economy. And what happened toward the middle to late 1980s, I know very well. I was in the banking industry. I helped people go out of business. I helped farmers get out of their farms. And I cried with them in their kitchens. It's no fun. But the money that we're giving away in this bill would be money that we can use to help farmers, to help businessmen, to pay for flood protection, to bring a fresh water source, and provide property tax relief. Please, on behalf of my county and my county's residents that own 22% of this money, do not give this away.
Senator Sorvag.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, I didn't intend to speak, but I do need to comment a little on the previous speaker's comments. I do live in that community also, and I am very, very concerned about our drinking water. I'm very concerned about our flood. But I also know, by studying the bills and the budgets, and ones I've carried, we will pay for those with the Resource Trust Fund. And guess what? The Resource Trust Fund won't have much money with the triggers in effect. The Resource Trust Fund will not generate funds to pay for water projects. If that's your argument, then you should vote green on this bill, because it puts stability to drive stable funds into the fund that'll pay for water projects.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, the question's on the final passage of House Bill 1476 as previously amended. Would the Secretary please open the key? Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote? Secretary will close the key. The final tally on House Bill 1476 reveals 32 senators voting yea, 15 senators voting nay. The bill is passed. Senator Klein.